Blood Satellite.
This one is titled Programmed to Kill. Now, have you heard about this book before?
No, I have not.
This is a book that if you were ever looking at a reading list from the alt-right, dissident right, just kind of like weird internet stuff, this was always in there. This one and the one we'll be talking about next episode, which is Eye of the Chicken Hawk, and both of those are related. But this book was written by David McGowan. David McGowan, who also wrote a book that we covered many, many episodes ago, Weird Scenes from the Canyon, about the involvement of the CIA in the hippie scene in the 60s. And both these books are pretty well related. There's a lot of overlap because they both concern government conspiracies in various capacities. But Programmed to Kill, there's some parts of it I disagree with. Some of the examples I'm not sure fit with the rest. I'd say it's told in this sort of a rambling fashion. It jumps around a bit, but the headline is this, and I do agree with this, that there is a interplay between the government, the CIA, and experiments like MKUltra into utilizing trauma to create killers, basically. There's interplay between that and the rise of serial killers in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And there's also a connection to those experiments in generating trauma with a lot of these child rape sects, cults, syndicates, whatever you want to call them, because one of the main ways you would create a serial killer or a murder is with sexual abuse, kind of fracturing their relationship with authority and loving family to create these agents that can be manipulated. So it's drawing parallels between a lot of these. Now, some of the examples I disagree with. However, there's one thing that it establishes that I found very, very fascinating. And if there's one takeaway from the book, it would be this. It's that the entire idea of serial killer is up in the air. And it's challenging the very idea that there is such a thing as a serial killer profile. Now, first of all, do you have any thoughts on that? Like, what do you think about serial killers? Just based on what I'd said, does any of that track?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that much about the topic, but it sounds right.
Well, one of the claims made in the book, and this was just something I'd considered recently because I'd heard other accounts of this, was that a lot of cases that were pinned to individual serial killers ended up being a team working together, right? A famous one would be the Zodiac Killer, right? A lot of people would assume that the Zodiac Killer was one person. And we automatically believe that these killings must be committed by one person, right? But then someone just floated the idea, well, what if it was just two people? That blows the whole fucking thing wide open because they have this conflicting evidence that maybe shoe prints don't match. It's like, hey, here's an idea. What if it just wasn't one guy? If it was just two people, now you don't need the shoes to match. And maybe the two top suspects you had, both who, if you can prove they knew each other, boom, there you go. One famous case was John Wayne Gacy. If people remember John Wayne Gacy, if you're a weird kid, I'm a white guy. I'm a white millennial. So we've just been inundated with serial killer stories for most of our lives. There's always been shows and movies, and if you were into the early internet, there's all kinds of lurid details about serial killers, right? And even now, how many fucking Netflix shows are made about Jeffrey Dahmer? But John Wayne Gacy was notable because he's a great big fat clown, right? What a freakish character that would be, right? And they caught him with like dozens of bodies buried under his crawl space of his house, right?
John Wayne Gacy was a businessman and a politician. To everyone around him, he was a sweet and charming man. No one in his life could have guessed that he dressed up like Pogo the Clown and murdered teenage boys after dark. The Chicago Police Department found 27 bodies buried in his basement. They knew that his kill count, though, it was at least 33, and there could be more victims that were simply never found. This story became front-page news and immediately captivated the nation.
And so here's a guy kidnapping young men and sexually abusing them and burying them there. And one aspect of the case that's never brought up, but he maintained viciously up until the day he died, was that he did not work alone. and that up to half a dozen people had keys to his house, and him and many others were always telling stories about how Gacy was just part of a facilitator of this larger group that was like kidnapping people and torturing them and killing them for reasons beyond just sexual compulsion.
Did you see Flesh Simulator's documentary on this like a couple months ago? Because he was claiming that this may have been one of the first times that somebody has pulled all of this together. But he was talking about that fact that a lot of other people had the keys, and that not only did a lot of the other people who had keys were known rapists and serial killers who themselves did time, but a handful of them were people who inexplicably never did any time and were tied to chiefs of police and congressmen and then died of old age. And that it is very possible that if anything, John Wayne Gacy was actually the fall guy. He was one of the first fall guys before the whole thing started to collapse.
That is the story, that he was the fall guy, and he wouldn't be the first one. And that really challenges the entire idea of a profile, because the profile of a serial killer is that they work alone. Of course they work alone, because they're so individualized to their fetish of killing that it would never occur to them to work, with a partner. But there actually are cases in the past of Henry Lee Lucas was the famous example given in this, where it's like he's one of the most prolific serial killers in history. And
after his release, Lucas met Otis Toole in Florida. The two became lovers and went on a spree of robbery and murder.
Yeah, he had a partner. So what does that do to your profile, right? And why is there no discussion of serial killer teams? That actually seems like it would make much more sense. It would be easier to kidnap people, would it not? And we accept that there would be syndicates and teams when it comes to sex trafficking, especially child sex trafficking. Rarely do they work just alone. Usually they're part of some kind of group, right? So why would it also not apply to this? And also there's a lot of overlap between killings and pedophilia. But I'll just start. There's a lot to get to here. And I'm going to skip around a little bit, but there's a lot of really great examples. So it starts with an infamous case of a guy named Marc Dutroux.
What he did is incomprehensible. He kidnapped children, locked them in a dungeon, raped and tortured them, then killed them. Some were left to starve to death, others were buried alive. Only 2 survived. Now Dutroux has finally been found guilty and sentenced to life for his crimes. But that still doesn't answer these questions. Why was the police investigation such a debacle? And how many more people, important people, were involved in this evil plot? Questions which still haunt those 2 survivors.
And I was talking about this guy recently. I forget where I was doing it. Maybe it was even on the show. I'll just give him the story. Dutroux, convicted along with his wife in 1989 for the rape and violent abuse of 5 young girls, the youngest of whom was just 11, now stands accused of being a key player in an international child prostitution and pornography ring whose practices included kidnapping, rape, sadistic torture, and murder. Dutroux was sentenced in 1989 to 13 years for his crimes, but was freed after having served just 3. Shortly after Dutroux's release, young girls began to disappear in the vicinity of some of his homes. Though technically unemployed and drawing welfare from the state, he nevertheless owned 6 houses and lived quite lavishly. His rather lucrative income appears to have been derived from trading in child sex slaves, child prostitution, and child pornography. Police did search one of his homes on no less than 3 separate occasions over the course of the investigation. On at least 2 occasions, 2 of the missing girls were imprisoned in a custom-built place in his basement, a dungeon in his basement. But apparently these searches came up empty. It was not until August 13, 1996, 4 years after the disappearances began, that authorities arrested Dutroux along with his wife, who was an elementary school teacher, a lodger, a policeman, and a man the Guardian described as an associate with political connections, elsewhere identified as Jean-Michel Nouhou, a Brussels businessman and nightclub owner. So you start to see, when you talk about Marc Dutroux, the story is, here's this fucking loner weirdo who is just kidnapping girls. But the moment you start pulling on this thread, you see that he was part of a crew. He was just one member of this team that was kidnapping people, and he was keeping these girls in his dungeon and usually sending them elsewhere. Like, he was involved in so many kidnappings that couldn't find the bodies. And you would hear stories about this guy is suspected of killing 50 girls, but they only found 10. We just haven't found the graves yet. Yeah, you can't find the graves because you know he kidnapped them and you don't know where they went after that. They probably went overseas. And that a lot of these serial killers are, in fact, just facilitators or mules for human traffic. That's the claim made in this book. And for what it's worth, I believe that. I think that's maybe not all of them. To say that there's no such thing as a man who kills for sexual reasons, I don't accept that. I don't accept that Jeffrey Dahmer. That it probably is what he said. Like, I think in the book, he tried to rope in Ted Bundy. Like, is Ted Bundy? I'm like, no, I think Ted Bundy was just a guy who liked to rape and beat up women. Because that's all he did. He didn't kidnap them and like torture them in a basement or keep them. He was a man running through the streets and raping. You'll still have that, okay? So it's easy to go a bit too far with these theories, but. So he says, if the Marc Dutroux case were some kind of aberration, it would still be a disturbing story for the level of unspeakable corruption and depravity of the Belgian political and law enforcement establishment of which it speaks. Far more disturbing is the fact that it does not appear to be an isolated case at all. As 1999 drew to a close, the nation of Latvia was rocked by a child prostitution, child pornography scandal that reached to the very top of the political power structure. The case first broke in August when police uncovered a massive operation involving as many as 2,000 severely abused children. When media reports began linking top Latvian officials to the case, a special parliamentary commission was assembled to investigate the emerging allegations. On November 27th, 2002, The Guardian reported that many among Portugal's elite were linked to a pedophile ring as well. A scandal over a pedophile ring run from a state orphanage gripped Portugal as it threatened to engulf diplomats, media personalities, and senior politicians. So these are just two other cases. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about child sex trafficking rings, child kidnapping rings that are linked directly to the highest echelons of political power. A story we've all heard before. No one would be surprised by that story, but I think few people really dwell on what that means other than, they're just pedophile. It's just individual pedophiles randomly bumping into each other. It's like, no. Consider for a fact that maybe this is being driven by the government. Maybe Marc Dutroux is not just a paid actor. Maybe he actually is just a mercenary serving at the behest of the powerful who are actually, in fact, controlling all of this. You rarely hear that part brought up. And really what he gets into the book, I would say the other beating heart of this book is the existence of snuff films and whether or not snuff films really exist. Because when I was a child, it was believed that snuff films were, urban legend, right? But once you start digging into the details, not only were they, out there, but they seem to be pretty readily available. And we'll get into this in the next episode on Eye of the Chicken Hawk, but in case I don't get to it then, and this makes perfect sense if you think about it, most of the time snuff films are created not for wide distribution, right? It's not that there's a snuff film and then it's just like sold to people. Every snuff film is made to order, right? That's how they said it's done. So you need to go to the trafficker and say, here's what I want done, and then you pay for it, which means that police can never really get a copy because it would require that the police actually pay to produce one. You'd almost never stumble across one because they're made to order per person, right? And once I heard that, I'm like, that makes sense. So of course there's snuff films, but it's not easy to get one because you would need to either be the person, you need to kill someone who has one or order one yourself. But it's not like drugs, right? Anyway, he says here, in September 20, 2002, the Chicago Sun-Times carried a brief report of two brothers who were arrested and charged with possessing an enormous collection of child pornography, 5,000 photographic images, around 100 tapes and 8mm films. Among the evidence were images of young girls apparently tortured, raped, and killed. The American media has shown no inclination to shine any additional light on the case. An account of a recent Italian case carried by The Guardian affirms the existence of snuff films. Police have discovered a massive international pedophile network selling violent child pornography and trying to identify 5,000 people who are attempted to purchase the videos. Now, he makes another point here, which is interesting. I don't have the data to back this up, but seems important. It says, according to investigative author Gordon Thomas, the majority of child pornography produced worldwide is targeted at the U.S. So it's primarily an American marketplace, a consumer market that's driving it. Where by the early 90s, it was already a $3 billion a year business and growing. Thomas claims that, according to law enforcement figures, over 22 million copies of these videos are sold or rented in the U.S. in 1991. He also writes that much of the material is produced domestically, where it's the part of the largest segment of the movie making in the United States. What is known, though, is that the reports of child abuse have skyrocketed between 1963 and 1988. Reported cases of child abuse rose from 150,000 to 2 million per year, a 1,300% increase in just a quarter century. Child abuse may, in fact, be the most prevalent crime in American society and possibly the most significant as well. Given that it provides the breeding ground for so much of the crime epidemic that we're seeing right now. So that's the other part to pay attention to, that child abuse, according to these figures, has significantly increased in a very specific window of time. So what he's trying to do is connect the increase in child abuse to also experimentations in trauma. And if we accept that it is powerful people, not only powerful people, but powerful people in a specific geographic area that are driving it, then is it possible that they are driving it for reasons other than sexual gratification? And it is, in fact, about almost creating like soldiers through these children, or creating broken people for other purposes. That's one of the things he tries to get to in the book. The other thing is that if we accept that serial killers sometimes work in groups, maybe oftentimes work in groups, then their choice of targets are up for question as well. And you start talking about like how many of these serial killer targets were actually government hits, right? Because he was saying that, you know, the idea of a serial killer profile is that they tend to kill the same person or the same type of person, or they have a victim that fits the profile. And if you look at many of the most prolific serial killers, they don't even really have a type. You know, it might be men or women, but different types of men and women, which makes you think, oh, like, were these people targeted for reasons other than just complete sexual randomness? That's the argument he's making here, that they're using serial killers as government agents to take out people for specific reasons. Now, what do you think about all that? I gave you a lot.
Honestly, that's believable. There's so many connections, both to like to secret government programs, CIA and whatever else, but also just like generally to institutions, to the Senate and to Congress and to, you know, banks and wherever else. It would not surprise me at all to learn not only that there are connections between the killers, but there are organized institutional connections as well. It's not surprising. It's just something that we'll never know all the stories. And as soon as people start figuring them out, those people start dying. So
yeah, and it gets tied into the Satanic Church as well, which is seen as a joke these days, the subject of Netflix documentaries. But, you know,
that might also be part of the play too.
I would assume it is, that people just think, oh, yes, because they were denying that Satanists existed not long ago. And it's like, well, of course we exist. They're everywhere, and they're just fine.
And they're just a bunch of jokey goofballs who go to Comic-Con.
Have you checked their subreddit?
Yeah,
they like Rick and Morty more than anybody. It says, in one example, is also implicated in one of these cases was Democratic Congressman Barney Frank, whose D.C. home, and that's a name people will recognize, whose D.C. home was used as a base of operations for an escort service from late 1985 through mid-1987. The service was run by Frank's lover, Stephen L. Goby, the son of Marine Corps Master Sergeant and Pentagon budget analysis. Frank wrote a number of letters to probation officials on behalf of Goby, who had 4 felony convictions from 1982. Those letters provide the necessary cover for the ring, which Frank denied having knowledge of. Goby also regularly operated out of Chevy Chase Elementary School. You know, this is a very grim thing, but it is funny that Chevy Chase has a school named after him.
Maybe it's a different Chevy Chase.
I think there's only one, buddy. Inclusion with the Magnet School principal, Gabriel L. Massaro, a former school counselor. The school was home to 350 students aged 9 to 12. Massaro vigorously denied that any students were involved in the callboy operations, while he eventually admitted they were run from the school. What a thing to say. So, really, and this is a dimension that a lot of people are aware of, but they kind of ignore, like how many times orphanages, schools, and daycares are bound up in that as well. Like people, I hate to say it, I know it sucks out there, but you gotta distrust daycares. Like daycares are fucked, man. Like even out where I live, like unless you can really vet them, like some of these daycares I hear stories about, it's like it's just a bunch of kids locked in a room, and I'm like, that can't be good. Like, and then what else is going on with the doors closed? You know what I mean? Like, so that's what you do to break people psychologically. And here's another one. One of the names that surfaced at the Bonici trial was that of Michael Aquino, the high priest and chief executive of the Temple of Set, an overtly satanic cult that split from the Church of Satan in 1975. Besides tending to those duties, Aquino also had been known to occupy time serving as a lieutenant colonel of military intelligence of the U.S. Army. Aquino was identified in court by the mother of a victim as being a key player in a nationwide pedophile ring. Paul Bonacci himself had also positively identified Aquino as an associate of King, who had known and was known to the children only as the Colonel. The Presidio case had confronted both the public at large and the mental health community with an extraordinary and abhorrent situation of grave psychological proportions: the willful molestation of young boys and girls by representatives of the most patriarchal and supposedly protective arm of the U.S. government, the U.S. Army. A month after the raid, a fire, which the Army deemed accidental, destroyed the Army Community Services building adjacent to the Presidio Daycare Center. So just to back that up, this was a daycare that was on an Army base that was at the center of a child sex trafficking thing.
Yeah.
And then it mysteriously burned down, of course.
Yeah, the number of cases of the office burns down, or the evidence room in the police station burns down, or we lost that piece of evidence, like in the case of like the Bundy and these guys. It's like, hold on, are you telling me that like 500 pounds of cards, of handwritten cards with names and addresses, just those, all of them have been lost, and you have no clue where they've gone? Like there's too many of these, and it always seems to be the ones that tie the government to fucking pedophiles and child trafficking.
Well, and also, like, I know some people will say that this is just a feminization of the government, but it is true, because in what other field would you accept a whoopsie daisy of that magnitude? It's like, I just lost it. What do you mean you lost it? It happened. It's lost in the shuffle. What do you mean? Who's getting fired?
Like the Waco door. Like, how do you lose a door? Like, come on.
It's like, no, you have an entire system set up to not lose things. You have evidence lockers. Oh no, it's just, I don't know. Like, what? No, they don't even give an excuse anymore. They just say Butterfingers. It says, as disturbing as the Presidio case was, it was just one of many ritual abuse cases directly tied to one or more branches of the United States Armed Forces. As the Mercury News reported, by November 1987, the Army had received allegations of child abuse at 15 of its daycare centers and several elementary schools. There was also at least 2 cases of Air Force Air Force daycare centers, and another in a center run by the Navy. So again, we're building a case that it seems to happen disproportionately associated with places where it should be this. You would imagine it would be stricter in these areas, and for some reason it's not. And then we go right into the finders. Now, we've talked about the finders before, so just to refresh people's memory here, authorities investigating the alleged abuse of 6 children found with 2 men in Tallahassee, Florida. Park discovered material yesterday in the... I'm reading from a news report here. Discovered material yesterday in the Washington area that they say points to a 1960s-style commune called the Finders, described in a court document as a cult that allegedly conducted brainwashing and used children in rituals. It was nearly 7 years before the press revisited the Finders case, with a follow-up provided by the U.S. News and World Report. Most likely, the strange saga of the Finders would have disappeared forever if not for the rumors surrounding the case that would not seem to go away. One of the unresolved questions involves allegations that the Finders are somehow linked to the Central Intelligence Agency. Customs Service documents reveal that in 1987, when customs agents sought to examine the evidence gathered by Washington, D.C. police, they were told that the Finders investigation had become an internal matter. interesting. So, the Finders is going to ring a lot of bells for people, but that was, again, a strange brainwashing cult, children involved, trafficking around the country, around the world even, that the case dropped dead because they just seem to have some connections to federal government. It's just a place you're not supposed to look. And that's where so many of these cases end up. But like as you're seeing, I was describing this to someone the other day because I read these books back to back, this and I, the Chicken Hawk, that you're aware of these cases. You've probably heard them before, but rarely do people just stack them beside each other, right? In any sort of sequence. And once you do, the patterns emerge. Is it ever really the case that's just a lone pedophile? No. And of course, they're all connected. And of course, if the government is aware, what the fuck is going on? And I just have to return to Comet Pizza. Remember Comet Ping Pong Pizza?
It started with what turned out to be a bogus news story suggesting that Bill and Hillary Clinton were running a sex ring out of a Washington, D.C. pizza parlor. The whole thing turned truly frightening when a man showed up at that pizza parlor with a gun 2 weeks ago demanding to know more. And now this has become the center of a national debate over fake news.
And John Podesta and just me alone in the wilderness saying, whatever happened to that? There was something there. We all agree.
That shit was so obvious. It glowed so hard. And the funny thing is, I still see it brought up fairly often, but it's brought up by the left to mock stupid right-wing conspiracy theorists, as if it's so obviously been proven false. It's like, wasn't it just like last year, one of the women who had still been investigating it died in a suspicious car accident, like literally a year ago or 2 years ago? Like, I think you had that in the notes from a couple of weeks ago, and I had looked her up. But like the Comet Ping Pong thing was not only real.
Oh yeah, I know that woman. Yeah, we're going to talk about her next.
Our people who have been investigating this are to this day, like 10 years later, still getting assassinated. If you pull on that thread, they will fucking kill you, and they're still doing it. That's how real that one is.
So, guys, leftists, I know so many of you were molested, but we need to come together and agree that being molested is bad.
It actually is not good.
It's something that we're trying to prevent, and it seems that people on our side of the political autism spectrum, we're the only ones that care, and that's a weird thing to feel lonely about, right? Yeah. And look, you guys hate the government too. I get it. Would it make sense that the most powerful and influential state in world history would have at least one person in its circle, its orbit of influence, that would be tasked with being a fixer? Meaning that, look, we need a guy who can procure drugs, women, children, whatever it is to make the four dignitaries happy, to make the weird Chinese billionaire happy, whatever. I think there's at least one guy who's got to do dirty work for the American government. I know this is taking time away from you complaining about the CIA making exploding cigars or whatever the fuck. But just imagine the same CIA you hate. Do you think they could do anything with children? Or are they not evil enough for that?
Yeah.
Right? I'm really trying to meet you halfway here. So it's like these people would reject the premise that America would never do something secret like that. They would never. You know what they love? They only murder black children in public. Do you think they can do anything else with children otherwise? No, it's just shooting them because they're jealous of black children.
They'll believe that crack was created specifically to fuck with black people, which is like maybe true, but doesn't need to be true because it is just black people doing crack. But they'll believe that, but they won't believe the pedo shit, which is so much more obvious and damning.
They think the government could efficiently create something as good as crack? No.
Don't let the government have that much credit. Come on. I'll bet you the government created galaxy gas.
Yeah, the government did create galaxy gas. Too late, too. Like the time for galaxy gas was the 90s. Galaxy
come on, now. Dude. Give me a break.
Oh, we just invented fucking absinthe. We're done. We're not doing that anymore. We're not doing the fucking spoon with the sugar. It's fucking gay. It's over. So here's an interesting part. It says researcher Arlene Tyner. You're going to hear that a lot in this book. Researcher this, biographer that. It pulls from a lot of people who I can't verify, but whatever. This is the soup we're sitting in now. It says researcher Arlene Tyner, who has spent a considerable amount of time interviewing and corresponding with victims of mind control operations, noted in a Probe magazine article that some of these victims were turned over to military CIA doctors by pedophile fathers or other sexually abusive relatives. CIA officials also blackmailed family members known to produce kiddie porn in order to gain control of their already abused and psychologically fragmented children. It is certainly within the realm of possibility that the high-profile child pornography raids in recent years, which invariably result in relatively few arrests and even fewer prosecutions and convictions, are not intended to punish the victimizers, but to identify and compromise them. Fair enough. And it is not inconceivable that the databases being compiled will be utilized as something of a recruitment list to identify those persons who have been preconditioned, so to speak, for future mind control operations. As we said before, you're looking for people who are susceptible to mind control, susceptible to influence. This is what cult leaders also do. You're looking for people who are broken. And Charles Manson is brought up later in the book. Like, how did Charles Manson work his magic? Well, there's a lot of connections between Charles Manson and these sorts of programs as well, by the way. We'll get into that if we have the time. But it's like, you're looking for broken people. It would stand to reason that you would want these sexually abused people just so you can turn them into something else. And this would lead into people noticing that, hey, it seems that serial killer cases have gone down. I don't even know if that's true. That, based on my reading, that seems to be true. Maybe we just gather the data differently, but there does seem to be a golden age of serial killers that you don't really see anymore. So we either found a different name for them, or maybe those experiments stopped, right? Or maybe the people driving it decided to move into something else. Just a thought. There's the case of Henry Lee Lucas, who I mentioned. I'm just going to go into this because his story is fucking wild, and he's really held up as sort of the archetype of what he's talking about here in many different ways. He says, on June 30th, 1998, Henry Lee Lucas, arguably the most prolific and certainly one of the most sadistic serial killers in all of American crime, was scheduled for execution in Texas. Given the advocacy of the death penalty by then Governor George W. Bush, things were not looking good for Henry. Bush had not granted clemency to any condemned man throughout his tenure as governor. On June 18th, just 12 days before the execution, Governor Bush made a special request to the Texas State Board of Pardons, whose members were all Bush appointees, to review the case. Strangely enough, 8 days later, the board issued a recommendation that Henry's execution not take place. Just a couple years into his incarceration, he told the story in a book written for him by a sympathetic author. The book, entitled The Hand of Death, the Henry Lee Lucas story, tells of Henry's indoctrination into a nationwide satanic cult. Lucas claimed that he was trained by the cult in a mobile paramilitary training camp in Florida Everglades. His training, he said, included instruction in abduction and arson techniques, as well as the fine art of killing up close and personal. Henry further claimed that the leaders of the camp were so impressed by his handling of a knife that he was allowed to serve as an instructor. Following his training, Henry claimed that he served the cult in various ways, including as a contract killer and the abductor of children, whom he delivered to a ranch in Mexico near Juarez. What Henry claimed essentially is that what appeared to be the random work of a serial killer was in fact a planned series of crimes often committed for specific purposes. Some of the murders were political hits, according to Henry, including assassinations of foreign dignitaries, local politicians, or wealthy businessmen. This was not true for all of Henry's crimes. Some he just did because that's what he liked to do, and it was one thing that he was really good at. The beauty of this arrangement was it allowed Henry to conceal his true motives and many of his crimes. Now, could these be the selfish, self-absorbed ramblings of an imprisoned man? Maybe. But I'm choosing to believe it for the purposes of this episode. Now, and what is to back up these claims that the military even does anything like this? And I'm reading a part here, a quote. It says, a U.S. Navy psychologist claims that the Office of Naval Intelligence had taken convicted murderers from military prisons, used behavior modification techniques on them, and relocated them in American embassies throughout the world. That Navy psychologist was Lieutenant Commander Thomas Narut of the U.S. Regional Medical Center in Naples, Italy. The information was divulged at an Oslo NATO conference of 120 psychologists from the 11-nation alliance. The Navy provided all the funding necessary, according to Narut, Dr. Narut, in a question and answer session with reporters from many nations, revealed how the Navy was secretly programming large numbers of assassins. Anyone familiar with the intelligence community's long-standing obsession with the concept of mind control will immediately recognize that Dr. Narut was describing an MKUltra project. The operation described by him involved killers drawn from military prisons, though there was a good possibility that parallel programs were being introduced and conducted in civilian prisons as well. This conference was in 1975 that he said this. So there is, and again, when I'm saying this should surprise no one. It should surprise no one that they would even try something like this. And it goes into more detail here about the serial killer profile. It says most Americans are probably familiar with what is considered the classic serial killer profile. This was a notion first put forth by the venerable FBI, which coined the term serial killer and pioneered the concept of profiling in an alleged attempt to understand the phenomena of a mass murderer. If people have ever watched that show Mindhunter, it's a fine enough show, but it's all about this. It's about the creation of the serial killer profile. It appears to be the case, though, that the concept of the serial killer profile was put forth largely to misinform the public. And there's another case. I think it was the Oakland child killer, or it was in Atlanta. There's a famous case. It might have been in Atlanta, and this was covered in season 2 of the show, of a serial killer that was killing black children. And everyone thought it was a white person. It was a KKK member, a skinhead of some kind, and it was a race crime. And it turned out to be a black man who was caught red-handed disposing of a body, right? So that he wasn't just an innocent guy. He was caught disposing of a child's body that he murdered. And one thing that everyone acknowledged about the case was that this seemed to be a fall guy. That what was actually going on was there was, again, a network of pedophiles within the city that this guy was just grabbing up kids and delivering it to them, and then he was disposing of the bodies afterwards. So they claim they caught the guy, but they might have just caught one of 7 guys working for this larger organization. But then, case closed. We found the guy. We found the one guy without having to look into, the elites of the city. And it says, in the case of Henry Lee Lucas, few, if any, of the elements of the serial killer profile even apply. For instance, serial killers are said to act alone, driven to do so only by their own private demons. In Henry's case, this was a patently false notion. It has been officially acknowledged that Lucas worked with not just one, but at times as many as 3 accomplices. The victims, Resendez Ramirez, for instance, ranged in age from 21 to 88 years, with a mix of males and females. So he didn't have a type of person. He was old, young, all different types. The cause of death varied as well, with most being bludgeoned, though one was shot in the head, another stabbed, another had a pickaxe buried in her head. Though not readily apparent, almost all the weapons used for inflicting death had one thing in common. And this is interesting. I'm going to assume this is true as well. Almost all the weapons were termed weapons of opportunity. Notably, this precisely mirrors the means by which the CIA has historically taught its assassins to kill. A CIA training manual entitled A Study of Assassinations advises that the would-be killer should do the following. The simplest local tools are often the most efficient means of assassination. A hammer, axe, wrench, screwdriver, fire poker, kitchen knife, lampstand, anything hard, heavy, and handy will suffice. All such improvised weapons have the important advantage of availability and apparent innocence. The assassin may accidentally be searched before the act and should not carry incriminating devices of any sort or any sort of lethal weapon. But any lethal weapon can be improvised at or near the site. The mafia assassination known as Murder Inc., the brainchild of Lansky and Luciano, had a remarkably similar philosophy. So the idea is, and that's an interesting thing because you hear serial killers, it's like, oh, they use the same method every time too. No. If anyone uses a weapon of opportunity, perhaps that means trained assassin. Maybe that one's a bit of a reach, but I'll give him that. Maury Terry, as previously mentioned, had done an excellent job arguing that the case of the Son of Sam killings were carried out by multiple cult members, despite the media portrait of David Berkowitz as the proverbial lone killer. Susan Kelly has likewise done a great job of exposing the Boston Strangler killings as the work of several killers. Even before the release of Kelly's Boston Stranglers, there had been long speculation that the killings were not the work of one man. Most of the officials involved in the investigation, in fact, never believed that a single killer was responsible. I'll just end on this. This sort of brings it all together. It says, as the cases of Marc Dutroux and many others have amply illustrated, there can be a very fine line between organized pedophilia and serial murder. Perhaps nowhere has that point clearly been made than what was at the time America's most murder capital, Atlanta, Georgia, during the killings commonly referred to as the Atlanta child murders. This is what I was telling you about before. None of the pedophiles connected to the case were ever seriously considered as suspects, and certainly none were ever charged with any of the murders. There's little doubt, though, that many of the victims were involved in a large and well-protected child prostitution and child pornography ring. Unanswered, though, are the questions of why and by whom they were killed. While in it says here, McGill, a Miami cocktail waitress, claims that the murders were perpetrated by a cult involving drug trafficking, child pornography, and Satanism. The cult, she said, was comprised of members of both Georgia and Florida. One of the leaders was her part-time lover, Vietnam veteran Parnell Trahem. She claimed that she had witnessed both animal and human sacrifices and spoke of business murders that the cult had committed. It is not inconceivable that the killings were performed as human sacrifices. Some reports hold that several of the parents reported to independent investigators that the bodies of their children had crosses carved in their foreheads and chests. The profile of serial killers that has been presented in this book is obviously one that's quite different than one that's become part of our collective consciousness, or conscience rather. Rather than the profile of a lone predator driven by his own internal demons, we are finding instead the profile of a controlled assassins and controlled patsies, conditioned and programmed by a variety of intelligence fronts, including military entities, psychiatric institutions, and satanic cults. There's a very real possibility that an underground network of satanic cults has largely replaced the Mafia's Murder Incorporated as America's premier murder-for-hire organization. Researcher and author Michael Newton has drawn that conclusion in Raising Hell. He charges that the Black Cross, a faction of the process-spawned 4P cult, functions specifically as Satanic Murder, Inc. So that, in my opinion, summarizes the thesis of this book, and that's near the end of the book. But Murder, Inc., famous mafia hitmen, once associated with the government. There is a new Murder, Inc., but it's Satanic Pedophile Murder, Inc. Oh, what do you think about that?
Damn, buddy.
It gives you a lot to chew on. Some of the examples, I skipped and didn't include them. They're somewhat suspect, or at least a bit flimsier, but I think the overall picture painted, it's interesting. It's compelling. I could believe it, and if you don't believe that, or you would not entertain that possibility, I would ask that person why. Anyway, we've gone pretty long right now. I hope everyone enjoyed that, and I hope you had a great time as well. Thank you for taking the time, Judas.
Yeah, no worries, man. Take
All
care.
right, I'll talk to you later. Bye.
See you.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.